Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome to the Avexia webinar series. Our topic for tonight is 3x4, how to use the Blueprint Report in your practice. My name is Christopher Chu. I am the Director of Marketing for Avexia Diagnostics and will be your host for this evening. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of being joined by an outstanding guest, Dr. Yael Joffe, who will be our presenter for this webinar. For those of you who don't know Dr. Joffe, in her role as Chief Science Officer, Dr. Joffe brings over 20 years of experience in nutrition, genetics, sound research, clinical practice, and scientific integrity to 3x4. In the rapidly evolving discipline of nutrigenomics, Yael is globally acknowledged as a leading expert in the field. She is a highly sought-after speaker, has co-authored 2 books, It's Not Just Your Genes and Genes to Play, and has been published in multiple peer-reviewed scientific journals. Yael is at the forefront of nutrigenomic education and has helped develop and supervise nutrigenomics courses around the world, including her own Manuka courses, which have trained hundreds of healthcare practitioners globally. And if that's not enough, she is also currently an adjunct professor teaching nutrigenomics at Rutgers University and Maryland University of Integrative Health. And joining Dr. Joffe tonight will be Dr. Wayne Sedano, our Director of Clinical Support and Education at Avexia Diagnostics. Additionally, Dr. Sedano is the Director of Integrative Medicine Education for the College of Integrative Medicine and lectures and teaches internationally. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. We encourage participation. So if you have a question, you may submit that question in the questions fields in the right hand of the interface. We will answer submitted questions towards the end of the presentation. If your question is not answered this evening, you will surely receive an answer by email within a day or two. Without further delay, I will now turn the webinar over to Dr. Joffe.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the intro, and thanks everyone for being here today. We have quite a lot to get through, so we are going to jump in. This is very much Nutrigenomics 101, so you're going to be quite the expert by the time we're finished. But more importantly, we're not only going to give you a good foundation in what nutrigenomics is and isn't, but we're also going to give you some great insight into what you're going to find in the 3x4 Blueprint Report, how to use it with your patients, and really how to change the experience of genetics. So with no further ado, we are going to get started. And really, before we jump into the detail of the report, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page when we talk about what are those key genetic principles. And even before we get into genetic principles, I want to just touch on one point. And because I'm talking to Avexia practitioners, I know that I don't need to spend much time here. We're talking about upstream medicine, upstream nutrition. We're talking about fixing the root cause or root cause analysis. What is happening upstream that is manifesting as symptoms downstream, diseases downstream, and what role is genetics playing in this? So the best way I find of really upskilling you to be able to understand what is happening in genetics and the genetic marketplace is by looking at the terminology that you're going to encounter when you're working with any genetic test. And that's why I call this section Know the Difference. So let's start with some basics, but actually probably one of the most important, which is epigenetics versus genetics. This is extremely complicated. People think it's really simple, but it throws everyone. And in fact, often I'm called a epigenetic counselor, which is kind of like a nutritionist, dietitian, I guess. So let's make sure we understand the difference between the two. So we're going to start off by talking about genetics. Genetics is about code. It is our DNA sequence. We have 4 different letters in our DNA sequence, A, C, T, and G, whereas in English, we have like 26 letters. And in English, we use those letters to write words, and words come together to make sentences, sentences make paragraphs, chapters, and they tell a story. Now, genetics is no different. We only use 4 letters. We make words, which I'm going to tell you about now, called codons. We bring those together to make sentences, which are like genes. And the genes come together to write the story of who we are. But in essence, what is interesting about this genetic code is genetic variation. It's the difference between you and me and all of us. At 99.9%, we are identical to each other in our code, but at 0.1%, we differ from each other. And the difference is in these spelling changes. So often people talk about genetic variance, genetic variation, SNPs, polymorphisms, but one of my favorite ways of talking about it is a spelling change, because that's simply what it is. It's a change in one of the letters in our code that is going to have an impact. So how does it have an impact? As you can see here, here's a tiny little slither of DNA code. And the DNA letters, the A, C, T's, and G's, always come together in sets of 3, which we call a codon. And a codon is a code for an amino acid. And you all know that when you put a whole bunch of amino acids together, we get a protein change. And when we have a protein, it's going to be either an enzyme or a hormone or a neurotransmitter or any kind of messenger, which basically is the engine and driver of our body. But what happens in that 0.1% is we get these changes. And there's all different kinds of genetic variation we can have. This is a level of detail you don't really need to know, but for those of you who like going a little bit deeper, so we talk about, you can see, like when I use the word normal, I wish there were kind of inverted commas around that. But at some point, we can change one of the letters. So if you have a look where it says normal, and you, excuse me, and you see substitution 1, you can see that in the second codon, instead of having a C and a T and a T, you can have a C and an A and a T. And just by changing one letter, we can change an amino acid. If you look at the top row, we have in position 2, a glutamine, but in position 2, in substitution 1, we have a valine. And that's an example of a genetic variation. We can also get deletions, where a letter is missing, and that can change the amino acid completely. It can, in fact, delete the protein, delete the gene, delete the enzyme, or we can have an insertion where we get an extra letter put in. And essentially what we do in genetics is we study these variations, these differences, and understand how they are going to impact your life. Because in essence, what genetics is who are we? How do we respond to the world around us? How do we respond to the food we eat, the exercise we do, the stress we encounter, the trauma we may have? That is in essence what genetics is about. So one thing you'll probably never get taught is how to read a SNP or how to read a spelling change. When you see a journal article and you see an article, you'll always see these abbreviations of genes. ApoE, IL-6, TNF-alpha, CTF. So when we're reading a journal article, we want to pay attention. If it's written in capitals, it's a gene. If it's written in lowercase, it's a protein. So have a look at the examples. TNF-alpha, written in capitals, is going to be referring to a gene. TNF-alpha in lowercase is a protein. May not sound very important, but it's very important when you're trying to understand what is the impact of a gene on a protein. The other thing I want you to really understand is that we should never bring a value judgment to gene variations. So there's this word that always comes about. Sometimes I see it in MTHFR, sometimes I see it in other stuff, mutation. Many genetic testing companies will use the word mutation when actually all they're talking about is a spelling change, a different genetic letter. I've even heard defect, or even worse. The most we can remember is when you see a spelling change, do not judge it. Do not think this is a bad one and this is a good one. It's just like the kind of history of nutrition and food. We said there's like good foods and bad foods. It's really not about that, because remember, genetic variation is evolutionary biology. It's how we survived. So our genes mutated, or they became more variable in order for us to adapt to the world around us. The problem is the world around us changes much faster than our genes change. So we have all these genetic variations which kept us alive on the plains of Africa. ApoE being a perfect example of a really protective gene, E4, that now when we're surrounded by high fructose corn syrup and refined carbohydrates, it isn't working for us in the same way. But when you see a gene variation, try not bring the judgment of good and bad, try not use the word mutation, and rather think to yourself, what is the information, what is the insight that I'm going to gather from knowing about this variation, rather than what is the bad or the good that's coming from it, right? So how does epigenetics regulate gene expression? So now clearly we're moving from genetics, which is all about code, to epigenetics. And epigenetics is epi, above. It's everything around genetics. So there's two parts. There's insight and action. Insight is I'm unraveling that chromosome, I'm laying out that DNA sequence, and I'm reading the letters and I'm looking for the spelling changes. Epigenetics is a different story. Epigenetics asks the question, why does one gene switch on, make a protein that does something in our body, whereas another gene might be switching off and shutting down an enzyme in our body? And that is the world of epigenetics. So for the first 15 years of my career in this world, I only thought about SNPs and gene variants. And then I realized I was missing half of the conversation. That what I needed to be thinking about is first, have a look at sequence, which is essentially exactly what we do at 3x4 in the test that we have, and understand who your patient is and how they're different. But then to really be impactful, we want to understand how we can switch on genes that will help heal your clients, or switch off genes which may be causing some upstream effects that we don't want. And in essence, when we switch on and switch off, it's a process of what we call DNA methylation, where we attach a methyl group and it actually silences the gene. It stops it from functioning, it stops it from making the protein. We take that methyl group off, it unravels, it opens itself, and it can make a protein which can produce the enzyme. So always think about epigenetics as really switches, switching on and switching off, and what are the things that are going to make us switch on and switch off. And that is every single micro decision we have in our day. And I always try and get patients to understand the concept of micro decisions, that it's not like overall, generally, I eat a healthy diet and eat a lot of vegetables. It's every second and every minute of every day, everything will impact how my genes switch on and or switch off. So this is just an example of all the different variables that will change gene expression. So I know you will think about diet, I know you will think about exercise, I know you'll probably think about toxins, but it's much more than that. Think about the seasons, think about meditation, think about connection, social interaction, think about anxiety, depression. Every single thing about us and who we are in the world will switch on and switch off genes. So I like to put it into an equation. Health, and whether that is optimal health or it's resolving chronic disease or preventing disease, is the combination of our genes, our genetics, which is our code, and the choices that we make. Because epigenetics really is about choice. What we expose ourselves to, the foods we eat, the supplements we take. So that gives you a sense of the difference between genetics and epigenetics. Now let's bring it to my world, which is nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics. So nutrigenetics, remember genetics is about code. So when we study nutrigenetics, we look at an individual's genes, we look for the variations, we understand how those variations will be changing biochemistry or phenotype or physiology, how it's changing something about their world, and we give recommendations on what are the best choices they should be making. That is nutrigenetics. In nutrigenomics, we're going the other direction. We're saying, what are the choices, the epigenetic choices, because epigenetics, remember, are all those things that impact us, that we can make a recommendation to our client that are going to change gene expression, switch on genes or switch off genes in some way that helps our patients heal. And there's a beautiful relationship between nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics. Now, all of these concepts actually overlap. So you might say, why am I kind of reiterating? But you will hear the terminology in different ways. And I want to make sure that you understand what they mean. So I'm going to talk about a genetic concept that you will read in the literature called high and low penetrance. Now, this could be a different slide, and it could say high and low impact. And at 3x4, in all our education, and in fact in our report, you will hear the word impact all the time, because that is in essence what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand, how do our genes impact our client's phenotype or physiology? And what recommendation should I make based on that understanding? So what is high and low penetrance? So I'm going to explain the concept of it, but I want you to keep in mind something else, which is the idea of medical genetics versus lifestyle genetics. So long before we were having conversations about nutrigenomics and companies like Avexia were using tests like ours, the world of medical genetics was better known. This is where an individual has a rare spelling change. It's still only a spelling change, right? It's gene variant, but it's so impactful that by itself, it has the potential to cause a disease. Sickle cell anemia is a perfect example where just a simple spelling change, one nucleotide, one letter, can cause sickle cell anemia. We call that medical genetics because there's no diet or lifestyle or supplements or stress. It's just one SNP that changed a protein, that changed something so fundamental about our blood cells. And we would call that very high penetrance. So what does high penetrance mean? It means that the genetic variation penetrates, impacts the phenotype a huge amount. But the reality is most SNPs, even the ones are rare, are not 100% penetrance. So sickle cell anemia is. But let's talk about BRCA, BRCA1, the one that is very closely associated with breast cancer. So if you're Angelina Jolie and you're on every single magazine, you're talking about this gene called BRCA1 or BRCA2, and you go and have a genetic test, and they tell you you're positive for the mutation or the defect, and therefore you're going to get breast cancer. Absolutely not true. First of all, 95% of breast cancers are coming from what we call a polygenic, so many gene variants, low penetrance, so not very impactful environment, and only a small percentage of breast cancers are actually coming from the world of high penetrance, where the gene variant is very impactful. Also, we know that in BRCA1 breast cancers, that if you have the BRCA1 gene variant, your chances of developing breast cancer are between 40 and 80%. Now that's a really big difference, because people have this idea that there's a single number for genetics, that if you have the BRCA gene defect, you will have an 80% chance of getting breast cancer. Absolutely not true. And if you look at the research, you'll see that it actually ranges between 40 and 80%. Now that's a huge difference, because if the chance of getting breast cancer are 40% and 60% you can work with your diet and your lifestyle, you may not choose to have a double mastectomy. You may choose to go a more conservative route. And a brilliant paper came out last year by Farhead, where they looked at these high penetrance, high impact gene variants and tried to understand why someone would go on to get breast cancer and someone would not. So why would someone have 80% and someone 40%? And the answer was in low penetrance. So low penetrance is low impact, where the gene variant by itself will not in any way cause a disease. It will change something in your physiology and your biochemistry. It will interact with the choices you're making, your diet, your lifestyle, your environment, your exposures. But by itself, it will not cause a disease. But when we group a whole bunch of low penetrant gene variants together, it increases their power. And what they found in the article by Farhead is they found that what determined more than anything whether one individual who had the BRCA gene variant would go on to get cancer and one not was the low penetrant gene variants. A whole group of them that by themselves weren't powerful, but when we're grouped, would determine whether the high penetrance ones would express themselves. There's other reasons why the high penetrance SNPs would express or not, and that's about environment, toxins, exposure. So that's why understanding this concept of penetrance, remember penetrance is around impact, is really important. In 3x4 and in most of what you will encounter, we work in low penetrance, in low impact, because we're interested in the relationship. But remember that equation, H is equal to G, genetics, plus choices. Where if you want to do medical genetics, you use, it's a different journey, it's a genetic counselor and it's a doctor and it's very rare. But even then, something like this is going to help you understand why one person would express and one wouldn't. Okay. Here's something else. For the last 2 decades in the world of genetics, we have been talking about these single SNPs. And even though I can't see any of you, unfortunately, I have no doubt that you have been exposed to MTHFR, ApoE, and COMT. And I have absolutely no doubt that you have been told that MTHFR is associated with ADHD, autism, neurological problems, birth defects, and the list will go, cardiovascular disease, on and on. You would have been told that ApoE causes Alzheimer's, and COMT is associated with depression, etc., etc., etc. But remember the previous slide. By itself, a single SNP, a single gene variant, does not cause a disease. It changes something in the amino acid, in the protein, in the biochemistry, but mostly it works with other gene variants and interacts with your diet and lifestyle. And that is why at 3x4 we do things very differently. So what we do is we built this concept of pathways. And pathways really is just another word for polygenic risk scores. Polygenic, many SNPs looked at together in a similar pathway. So it could be a biochemical pathway or a metabolic pathway to see what the impact there is. Now, this is a page of the 3x4 report that you're looking at here. And you'll see it's divided into 6 categories. Cellular, and we'll go into the detail, don't worry. Systems, cardiovascular health systems, energy, activity, nutrients. And in each one, you're going to see a line. And each of those lines is what we call a pathway. We have 36 of them. And each pathway is a polygenic risk score. So it's a grouping of low impact, low penetrant SNPs that we score together to see if it's having an impact on your client's health. So what is the most important question you want to ask a company when you're trying to decide whether you want to work with them or not is how do you choose the SNPs that get included in the report? Because one of the things that's happened in the industry of genetics is this idea that if I've got 10,000 SNPs in my report, it must be better than your report, which only has 160. So as the industry got better at testing genes, companies started adding more genes in because the consumer thought they were getting better value for money when they were getting 10,000 tested and not 160. But that's not actually how it works. Just because you can test something doesn't mean you should. Because just because we can test it doesn't mean we know what to do with it, how to translate it, how to advise on it, understand the biochemistry, what impact it has. So the way we do it at 3x4 is we base it on two very well-known criteria. This is published: scientific validity and clinical utility. So scientific validity asks the question, is the science good enough? And clinical utility is this clinically useful? So when you're reviewing a genetic testing company, you always want to think, are they addressing the science? And many genetic testing companies are addressing the science. But that's only foundational. That's like the baseline. It's like an undergraduate degree. The most important thing is, can I use this information with my client in such a way that it'll be both useful to me and useful for them in the choices that they're making? So we have built a methodology with 8 criteria scores, 4 in scientific validity, 4 in clinical utility, that are quantitated or scored to be able to determine whether a SNP has enough good science and will be clinically useful enough for you to use with your patients. And if it doesn't score highly enough, it doesn't get included. And for that reason, we only have 160 SNPs in our report and not tens of thousands, because we know that every single SNP that we have in our report is both scientifically valid and clinically useful. Let's talk about principles in action. So now that I've given you some great terminology, and you will get, and we do have some great PDF documents that we'll share with you that had all of this written down, because it's quite a lot to take in with all the pictures to go back and review. So we talk about genes first. Now, most practitioners, when you ask them when they use a genetic test like this, they'll say, I'm working with a patient and I just can't seem to find out what's going on or what will work, and then I do a genetic test. So we'd like to challenge you into a different way of thinking, which is what we call the genes first approach. The best way we can serve our clients is by reducing trial and error, and incidentally, not just serve our clients, but serve ourselves. Because what we want to do is we want to decrease the amount of guessing and be able to make the best treatment decisions based on the information we have about our patient. And that's why we do clinical assessments, that's why we do testing, blood work, functional testing. We see the genetic test as a screening tool. It's the first place you go to give you a sense of what is happening with your patient before you go down any particular rabbit hole. So the way we see the genes first approach is, the first thing that genetics can do for you is give you a sense of where to start. What are the metabolic areas? Remember, there are 36 pathways to look at that are really being most impacted genetically, that may be areas where you want to start working on a patient, because you want to get like an 80-20 impact, right? I want to do 20% work in changing my diet and lifestyle to get an 80% impact. The second thing I want to think about is a pathway-based analysis. Of those 36 pathways I saw, which are the ones that are most impacting my client that I should stop working on? Is it detox? Is it inflammation? Is it histamine tolerance? Is it gluten? Is it choline? Then I want to figure out what are the most targeted lifestyle and diet recommendations I can make. Because you know, you don't want to give 100 recommendations to your patient. You want to give them just a few things they can start changing that are going to have the greatest impact. So how do we determine what those targeted impacts are? The next one is targeted supplements. Love supplements, but we don't want to give supplements in a trial and error mechanism. They're expensive. Most patients resent it. So how do we select the supplements that are going to have the greatest impact? And that's where epigenetics comes in, because there are some incredible supplements in the market that actually switch on or switch off genes, which is always what we're looking for. And lastly, and extremely relevant to Avexia, is what we call precision functional testing. So I love functional testing. I love blood testing. But where do we begin? So imagine that genetics is giving an idea of the protein expression, and functional testing is testing to see whether that gene has expressed itself. What the genes do is give you a place to start, because there's so many wonderful functional tests out there. They're expensive, some of them are invasive. Which ones should I be using with my patients? Because you're also going to have to repeat them. So what you want to use a screening test like genetics to be able to say, I can see there's something happening in hormones. I can see we need to focus here, understand hormones better, understand where it might be blocking. And the great thing about genetics and functional testing is they work forwards and backwards. So if you do a functional test and you get an answer, but you don't understand why you got the answer, a genetic test can give you some information about that. But vice versa, if you do a genetic test as a genes first screening tool, it can give you really good guidance of where to go next. And my clinical team has been doing an incredible amount of work with Dr. Sedano on how to pair together precision functional testing with genetic testing. All right, let's move on. So we've done knowing where to start. I think many of these slides I've spoken to. We want to understand, and the reason we're actually called 3x4 analysis, oh, listen to me, 3x4 genetics is we want to, it's 3, 3, 3, 3. So we want to know what are the 3 most impacted pathways that we want to start focusing on? What are the 3 most important diet interventions we want to do that are going to have the greatest impact? The 3 most important lifestyle recommendations, and the 3 most important supplements. And that's why the company is called 3x4. So diet and lifestyle interventions, and then targeted supplementation, which is stage 4. And there is our functional testing, precision functional testing. So now that we've got good terminology, we've had a look at why we would want to use a genetic test. Let's have a look at what's actually in this blueprint. So we see it as not just another genetic test, but really we're offering a complete genomic solution. It's based on a systems biology approach or a functional nutrition, functional medicine approach. You will come across other companies in the marketplace who will offer you a diet genetic test, a skin genetic test, a brain genetic test, but the reality is in genetics, nothing happens in isolation. And outside of genetics, nothing happens. And what I mean by that is that you never look at genetics as an answer. It's always an insight that you use along with other things that you know about your patient. You put it together, and that's where you get that deep, deep insight. And even inside genetics, we never look at methylation separate from other systems. And there are many genetic testing companies just do detox or just do methylation, because you don't know where it's coming from. It could be coming from upstream in cellular, it could be coming from hormones, it could be coming from energy, it could be coming from nutrients. So we like to look at it as a full solution. So we have 160 SNPs. There are 146 gene results because some SNPs come in 2s and 3s. We have 6 categories that I mentioned: cellular, systems, energy, activity, nutrients. And there are 36 pathways. Remember that every pathway is a polygenic risk score. So we do some other things at 3x4. When I had a clinic, a nutrigenomic clinic, what we found that we were doing was we were drawing pictures for every single patient that came in. This is what methylation looks like. This is detox. These are little macrophages that are causing inflammation in the plasma membrane. So when I built this test, I wanted to make sure that we could put something in that would make it really easy for you, the practitioner, to understand your patient's genetics, but it would also give you a tool to engage your client, because behavioral change only happens, as you know, when they engage with the information that you're giving them. So we use two things: visual conversation, which is the imagery you're going to see here, as well as the language of color. And I've been talking about impact, and we talk about follow the purple, which is wherever the purple is the highest impact. We don't talk about disease risk, we don't talk about penetrance, we talk about impact and color, and follow the purple. So we spoke about cellular. So in cellular, we're going to have all our core cellular defense mechanisms: methylation, inflammation, oxidative stress, and detox. This is our systems overview. It's got both general systems like mood and behavior, which is around anxiety, depression, memory and brain health, which is around cognitive function, memory loss, histamine overload, super insightful, hormone balance, how am I metabolizing endogenous and exogenous hormones, glucose and insulin. We've got bone health and collagen as well. And then we've got our cardiovascular ones, which will be there they are, those are the ones I just mentioned. And cardiovascular will be blood clotting, cholesterol, lipid metabolism, vascular health, the integrity of that vessel wall, and of course, blood pressure. Then we have one of our categories is energy. So it's not a diet, it's energy. And it tells the story of how do we consume calories, how do we store calories, how do we burn out calories? Because if there's one thing we know as practitioners, and even as individuals, we don't need to be qualified, we all respond to food and energy and calories differently. So for some of us, we're very driven to eat. We have a lot of hunger. We're hungry all the time. We want to snack all the time. We gain weight easily. It's difficult to lose weight. Whereas for others, that kind of exposure is not that fraught. That is the world of genetics. And every single infographic that you see in the 3x4 report is a story. And part of our training and our teaching is storytelling. Because if you can get one of your clients to engage with the story, you will get buy-in from them because they know they're different. They know that they are experiencing their weight journey in a different way from their friend, their sister, or their parents. So we talk about things like appetite and satiety because no one experiences hunger and satiety in the same way. Everyone, I thought we did for about the first 20 years of my career, but we really don't. The way we store fat, the way we burn fat, how easy or hard it is to gain weight and lose weight is all built into the energy. So there are the categories over there. Appetite, satiety, intake, and the impact of genetics is one of my favorite conversations. And I often do a whole webinar just on this conversation because it is one of my favorite. And then, of course, activity. So this does not matter whether you're a couch potato who just wants to take your dog for a walk around the block or you're an elite athlete, it's the same conversation. I've got 3 hours to train this week. What should I do with my 3 hours? What is my potential for exercise, for VO2 max, to be fit? What is my potential to incur an injury when I'm training? How do I avoid it? How much recovery do I need when I'm training? And again, it doesn't matter if you're walking or you're training for an Ironman. How much recovery do you need? Where do you sit on this continuum of endurance versus power? And it's a continuum, it's not an either or. Are you more likely to excel in more powerful sports, short and fast, or long and slow? And then again, what should you be doing for recovery? And you can see again that the picture is a story that you can share with your patient. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but every single picture is different for every one of your patients. So the picture changes, the colors change, depending on the genetic result of your client. Every picture tells a story. So there they are: training response, VO2 max, injury, power, endurance, recovery. And of course, we've got nutrients. We are a Nutrigenetics company after all. So these are the nutrients. And our genes will change how we metabolize and how we absorb these different nutrients. So the pictures that you're seeing here will change depending on the genetic results and what you need more of or what you need less of. So you'll see the B vitamins there, folate, choline, vitamin B12, salt, gluten, iron overload, and of course the infamous caffeine, which we see in most genetic reports, giving you information about how you respond. And you can imagine that sitting with a patient with this kind of imagery is going to be a great starter for a conversation. And there they are, so you can see what we're testing in nutrients. And you might be looking at this and go, that's missing, like you're missing this and you're missing that. If there is a pathway that's missing or there is a SNP that's missing, it means it didn't pass through our H criteria. Remember, scientific validity and clinical utility. It doesn't mean it won't be there in the future. We are constant, twice a year, we are adding new SNPs, reevaluating the pathways, and as soon as we do our, what we call Darwin, which is our criteria, and it passes, it gets put into the report. But if there's something missing, and if anyone is paying attention and has been working in nutrigenetics for a very long time, they may notice that there is one nutrient that has not been included in this report. And I don't know if you can put it in the chat. I will be super, super impressed if someone in the audience can tell me a gene that is in pretty much every single genetic test in the marketplace, but not in 3x4. And if you can come up with it, then I'll tell you why. Let's see how smart our practitioners are. All right, in the meantime, we're going to carry on. So I've actually mentioned this already, which is that our blueprints are a lot about visual, and we call it a visual conversation because we want not that traditional kind of Quest or LabCorp report where the practitioner has all the power and the client doesn't engage. We want your clients to get excited and engaged with the report, with the colors, with the questions, with the terminology, with the pictures, because that is where we will get to change behavior. And we do that with imagery and we do it with color. So here's our colors. Very high impact is going to be dark purple, high impact is purple, and there's a very good reason why we don't have the traffic light green, orange, red. Remember, we're not interested in bad genes and good genes. We're interested in how do genes impact these pathways, these grouping of genes. So this is just an example of something I mentioned earlier, where every patient that you have will have a different image in their reports. There's 6 infographics, and they'll be different because the reports will be different. And the more that you get to work with them, the more that you will understand the differences between them. And here's another example where all of the images act as a tool and a guide for you to tell your patient a story. Okay, so what can you expect? What are the components of the report? There is a summary plan. Let's see if we can go into it. A summary plan is where we identify the 3 pathways that are most impacted by genetics. It doesn't mean that they are the 3 pathways that you must focus on, because remember, we don't know your patient. We don't know who they are, what their medical history is, what the goals are, psychosocial. So we're just giving you some insight into what are the 3 pathways that came up, and you can see they're all dark purple, which means they're highly impacted. And then we provide 3 diet, 3 lifestyle, and 3 supplement recommendations for each of those pathways. Again, this is not telling you, the practitioner, what to do. You're the expert. You know your patient. We're giving you some insight from a genetics point of view that you will then take and use as much or as little is relevant to your clients. I actually mentioned this earlier. What is 3x4? It's the 3-3-3, 3 pathways, 3 diet, 3 lifestyle, 3 supplements. And then you will get a page of a couple of pages of results. So my favorite page by far is the pathway-based results, where in one page I've got all 36 pathways. Remember, every pathway is a grouping of SNPs. And because we talk about follow the purple, in 2 seconds, I can immediately go and see where the dark purple is and the light purple. And because, remember my first slide, which was root cause analysis, going upstream, we always want to start at cellular, then systems, then energy, activity, and so on. So immediately by looking at this, I don't need to have trained in nutrigenomics for 20 years. I can see that inflammation and methylation, which are core defense mechanisms for our cells, have been highly impacted by genes, and I may want to start right there. Remember, genes first to decide. When you become a little bit more affair with genetics, you can use our gene summary page, where these are the actual results of the 146 results, where we actually give you the name of the gene, the name of the gene variant, and the actual genetic result, and we code them by color again. So if you're like me and I pick up the report after I've had a look at the pathway page, which is the first page I ever look at, I go and have a look at the gene summary and I look which are the genes that are in the very high category and the high category as my starting point, because that's going to start giving me an idea of what I have to work with. But you can literally, when you're starting out in nutrigenomics, just work with the pathway page and the pictures, and it's a great place. As you become more upskilled and educated in this space, you can start deep diving into a little bit of a lower level of genetics. Here are our stories, 6 major biological categories, as I went through all of them, each of which have a story. We also have a glossary at the back where we describe for your clients all 36 metabolic processes in a very easy to understand language. They can understand quite tricky concepts like methylation, detoxification, histamine. And at the back of the report, for those of you who really like nutrigenomics and want to kind of just upskill yourself to going on to what we call an expert nutrigenomic practitioner, are the genes by pathway. Remember I said that every pathway is a polygenic risk score. Every pathway is a grouping of SNPs. If you want to know what those SNPs are, you can go to the back and you can see, if you look on the left, inflammation, it'll tell you all the SNPs and genes that were tested in that polygenic risk score. And because it's color-coded, it will also tell you which were the genes that most impacted inflammation. Obviously, the genes that are in purple had the highest impact on that pathway than the ones that are in gray. If they're in gray, it's no impact, and then you've got all the different colors. But we offer all kinds of other things. We have wonderful events. We have had Dr. Sedano as a guest and continue to have him as a guest, bringing his amazing knowledge to 3x4. We have events where you can ask questions, get answers. There are multiple touch points through mentorship with Dr. Sedano. Dr. Sedano has been working with our clinical team to become as expert as they are in this test. Where you need some support, where you need some mentorship, where you have a report back from a patient and you just need some guidance. Dr. Sedano now knows this test backwards, forwards, and inside out. So he's actually online with us today. And he's your go-to person, and he's obviously got access to all the education that we do. So before we go to Q&A, I'm going to just quickly do a very quick a chronic disease case study that just shows you very simply how we would use a 3x4 genetic test. So this is Fatima, and Fatima is 57. She's married, she's got 4 children, and she was the financial director of a clothing business. In fact, this business made commercial uniforms, so uniforms for industry, which becomes quite pertinent, you'll see. And she has been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. The reason she took the 3x4 test is actually she wanted to know what the best supplements were to take to help her as part of her Parkinson's treatment. That's why she came to our clinic. And that's not how it ended up being in the end, but that was her reason for joining. From a medical history point of view, she got severe fatigue, severe depression, anxiety, a lot of bloating and constipation. So we know there's some gut dysbiosis, osteoarthritis, as well as a raised cholesterol, and she is overweight. Limited exercise. She goes to a physiotherapist twice a week. She works extremely hard. And remember, if you're working in a factory where they are spraying chemicals onto fabric for industrial uniforms, you're going to have a very high exposure to toxins. As far as her food, it's all about culture and family. They have a lot of deep fried foods, a lot of curries and stews, followed by sweets, and it's big meals with the family all the time. And there's no holding back. Currently, she was on antidepressants and L-Dopa and a few supplements. Her mother had high blood pressure and a stroke. So pay attention. Whenever we talk family history, it's genetics, right? Father, cardiovascular disease, and her maternal grandmother had dementia. Right, let's see what we found. So I always like to think about it that before you look at the 3x4 genetic test, you always want to have a sense like, what do I know about this person, right? I know she's at Parkinson's. I know she's battling, she's not exercising, she's got a lot of chronic disease in her family, and her quality of life is very poor. That much we know. Now we're going to have a look at a genetic test and see what we can find. Remember what I said is I always start by having a look at the pathway page. And I always start upstream. So I would look at cellular and I would look at systems, and then I would work my way down. And you can see there's a fair amount of dark purple here. And the more you work with our report, the more comfortable you are at seeing just how much of purple is kind of normal and how much is a lot. And that just comes with time. But this is fairly a fair amount, particularly when we see we've got a high impact in methylation, detox, hormone balance, and cognitive decline and memory. I don't know if you remember that. I think it was her mother had dementia. We've got an issue around vascular and cholesterol, and there was a lot of cardiovascular disease in the family. So immediately, without having spent like more than 3 minutes, I'm already linking what I know about Fatima with what I'm seeing here in terms of her family history, her high cholesterol, and obviously what she's presenting with. And then we start looking at each area. So we look at cellular, and as you noticed, methylation, very high. And methylation is an interesting one. It's a great one to learn about. I always talk about methylation as how healthy is your DNA, because your DNA needs to make new DNA all the time. It needs to repair itself all the time. So if your methylation, which is really, remember, attaching methyl groups, producing methyl groups, repairing DNA, is not functioning optimally, you're going to have a lot of downstream effects. And definitely I would pay attention that detox is also come in as high. Systems, mood and behavior. Remember, she's so mood and behavior is really around anxiety, depression, bipolar, any of the kind of mood disorders. And this has come up as purple. Memory and brain health. So we know that I think her mother had dementia. And then she has a very high for hormone balance. So we want to pay attention to all of that. Cardiovascular, lots of family history around cardiovascular. She herself has a high cholesterol level, and her she's come up with 2 purples, vascular and cholesterol. A little bit going on around driven to eat. So appetite, satiety, intake, when we see purple, it's usually like snacking behavior, wanting to eat, feeling hungry, not feeling full. And then energy expended would be when we see purple, which is not really great at burning up energy. And then weight gain and weight loss resistance almost is like a summary. It's like easy to gain weight, not so easy to lose weight. And then interestingly, despite everything you've seen here, when we look at her genetic potential around exercise, we're like, wow, she actually has great genes to do not only endurance training, but power training as well. Like, I would love to have that kind of profile. And nutrients. So you can see caffeine, she's a slow metabolizer. So whatever she's drinking, the caffeine staying in her system quite a lot. Choline, folate, those are the two. And remember, we had methylation came up in purple, in cellular, and in nutrients, we've seen choline, folate, and vitamin B12. And we know what are the nutrients that support methylation? It's exactly those. So she's got a bit of a double whammy there. She's got an issue around how she's metabolizing and kind of supporting her B vitamins, and she's got in her methylation pathway. So what would we recommend? Well, the first thing is I would look at what other functional tests Avexia is offering that we would want to maybe do, maybe some methylation, further deep dive into methylation, organic acids, and some hormone balance. Remember, there was definitely something going on with hormones. And then you would come up with your 3-3-3-3 plan. Now, you don't have to do this. This is how we run our case studies. This is how we teach. You can take some of it, you can leave some of it, but it does help distill your takeaway from genetics before you go and build out your treatment plan. So we've chosen, and again, there isn't only one way, but we've chosen detox, methylation, and memory and brain health as the 3 pathways for us to start focusing on. Doesn't mean we're not going to get to the other pathways. It means that's where we're starting. We've chosen 3 areas of diet to focus on. So we're going to look at any foods that support liver detoxification, quality proteins, and then we really want to look at the kind of foods that would help with brain cell repair and neuroinflammation. Lifestyle, we want her to increase her exercise, which is going to help manage inflammation, dopamine, and all the kind of neurotransmitters. We need to work hard at getting toxins out of her environment, and how to manage stress in general. And then from a supplement point of view, sulforaphane, which is one of our favorite, high quality sulforaphane, is going to work on a lot of different levels. It's going to help on detox and on hormones, and a whole bunch of things. So we really, really want to work with that. B vitamins to support methylation, and we want to use some omega-3 as well. So just quickly, what was the progress we had with Fatima? We managed, actually it's so ironic that she came in for supplement recommendations, and we managed to improve all her Parkinson's symptoms to the point where they really didn't impact her quality of life. She lost weight, she had more energy, we resolved her gut dysbiosis, we got her exercise, those infinity swimming pools in her house so that she could swim every day. And really, you know, the thing is, we want to go upstream, we want to treat the root cause, we want to make sure we're offering the most personalized treatments, 80-20, understand where to start, understand where to focus to have the greatest impact. And I think that brings me to the end of my slides, and I'm going to hand back to Chris, and Chris is going to explain some things. I see we have no questions at all. And
no, we have a few. Yeah, we have a few.
I can't,
but
so I can't see them. That's true.
Okay, well, I will mention them once we get through this next part.
And is there anything in the chat? Because I can't see if anyone had a guess at the nutrient that was missing.
One, Denise Krebs said dairy. So I don't know.
Well done, Denise. Well done.
There you have it. So congratulations.
All right, I'll talk to that later, Denise. I'm going to hand over to Chris now. I'll come back.
Absolutely. That was amazing, Dr. Joffe. Thank you for that. So I hate to interrupt, but we're going to talk about how you can order this amazing test, the 3x4 test on Avexia link. So obviously you need to, first you will need to log into your Avexia account and go to the Avexia link, which is located in the left-hand column of the dashboard. Next, select or create a patient to assign the test to, then select specialty labs, and then in the drop-down, pick the 3x4 blueprint test. Finally, complete the test order by clicking the green place order button. Now you can see all the steps here on the slide. Please keep in mind that due to the personalized nature of this test, all orders must be processed through Avexia link and assigned to a specific patient. And I must also say that we are offering right now an introductory price for the first test performed under your account. You will automatically receive an account credit of $40 to reduce the cost of the test from $289 to $249. And with that, you know, obviously, if you have any questions about ordering, you can always email us at info@avexiadiagnostics.com or call us at 888-852-2723. I will read out the questions if that's okay with you, Dr. Joffe.
Yeah, I want to first just,
sure.
Was it Denise who got dairy?
Yes.
Was it Denise? So I just wanted to say well done to Denise, and I just want to address it quickly before we go into the questions.
No.
So what's actually missing is lactose. And pretty much every single genetic test that you will come across will have the lactose gene, either as the LCT gene or the M6MC gene. And we're the only test that doesn't, so I get asked a lot. And there's a very good reason. When we did what we call Darwin, remember, 4 criteria on scientific validity, 4 criteria on clinical utility, There is an incredible, I actually give a lot of presentations on this. I'm going to give you the very, very quick answer. There is a lot of research on the LCT gene, and the fact that there was this evolutionary change where we developed the ability to break down lactose with lactase, but some of us have this lactase enzyme and some don't. And so there's a great deal of science. So on a scientific validity point of view, the SNP actually scored really highly. But when we evaluated it in clinical utility, it actually failed horribly. And the reason being that when you have the genotype, when you have that spelling change for the lactose gene, you can land up having a little bit of lactase enzyme or a lot of lactase enzyme. So there wasn't a clear correlation between I have this genotype, I have a spelling change, and that means I have very low lactase, and that means I shouldn't have dairy. So in our clinic, we kept on telling patients, you've got the lactase gene variant, you shouldn't eat dairy. And they were like, oh, I had a latte for breakfast this morning, and I do every single day, and I'm 100% fine. So we found that the clinical utility, the clinical usefulness of the genotype of the genetic result was extremely low because there was too much variability between the genetic result and how much lactase enzyme. So that is why it didn't pass in our report, and that's why it's not in our report. So I just wanted to share that because I think it illustrates the point well. Okay, Chris, tell me what questions we've got.
Okay, so Ann Pico asked, how secure is the test result information? This would be very valuable for employers or insurance companies, etc. So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, great question. And that question should be asked every single time. Someone should ask it. So there's two ways data is protected. The one is by 3x4, and I'll talk about what that is. And the one is by the government. So there are, and we actually have a great document that we have written on data protection, which we're happy to send to you. And maybe you can make it available to all your practitioners that explain about the different laws in America that protect your data from being used. So that is one thing. So in 23andMe, when you do 23andMe and they use your data to sell to a drug discovery company without your name, you have given your permission. They cannot do it without your permission. We don't do that. So at 3x4, we have no interest in what we call third-party sales, where you take data, depersonalize it, and sell it to another company who use it for all kinds of reasons. We have no interest in it. We are about health and about practitioners and about helping clients. So we do not share any data. In fact, the only person who can have access to the data is you, the practitioner. The patient only gets the report after you've done a consult with your patient. And the patient can decide if they want to send their report to someone else. But not even you can send the report to someone else, right? It's the patient will say, can you please send my report to my MD or something? But they request it. We build the data in certain ways. We depersonalize it. So you'll see on your kit when you get it, it's got no name, nothing. There's no way. It's just a barcode. Okay. We separate out the actual genetics from who you are completely, and it sits in what we call separate AWS servers. AWS is the Amazon Web Server, where we store data, and we actually store it in two physically different servers so that there's no connection whatsoever for it. And the only time the recommendations for your patient get put together with the genetics is when you as a practitioner click the button that says generate report. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. The other thing to know is that we destroy DNA. Very important question to ask any company you decide to work with. If you work with them and say, like, what happens to my patient's DNA? There are some companies who biobank DNA, they store DNA, and it can be used later for research or all kinds of things. We do not even give you the option. We're not interested in that business model. So what happens is the moment that a genetic result is confirmed, because we actually test every SNP 3 times, and we only release a result if we get the same result 3 times, because then we know it's a clinically correct result. Then, and we hand over that result, then the DNA gets destroyed. End of story. If you want to go back and have something else tested, you've got to do a swab again. So there are multiple layers of security from the company, from the lab, and then from the government. And as I say, we have put this in a document, and we're super happy to share this with you.
Okay, that was a great answer. I will. There was a question from Lucy Bahala about the replay of the webinar, and I just wanted to let everyone know that a recording of this webinar will be available by email in the next few days. It'll be emailed to everyone who registered and attended tonight. So that's the answer there. Another question we have is from Gina Lee. Does 3x4 give targeted information for those with thyroid conditions like Hashimoto's or even autism? What age do you recommend for this testing? Can children take this test?
Okay, 2 questions, both very good questions.
Okay.
So we do not give recommendations for Hashimoto's, thyroid, or autoimmune because we are not practitioners, you are. What we give is insights, training, education on how to use genetics in situations. So we have a lot of training, and Dr. Sedano can speak to this a lot about, and we run a lot of educational programs about how can you use genetics with thyroid, with autoimmune, with Hashimoto's, with all different clinical conditions. It's a piece of the puzzle that you need to understand why someone would have developed Hashimoto's or a migraine or any kind of autoimmune or cancer or anything like that, but it's never a piece as well. And we don't tell you what to recommend. We give recommendations on the pathways, but not recommendations on the condition because we don't know your patient. And that's where working with Dr. Sedano, where you feel like you're missing something and you want someone to just deep dive a little bit more into the genetics and see what are the gems you can extract is great, and why we have so much education available for you. But it's really about you putting genetics as context. But the short answer is it plays a very big role and it's really helpful, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. And the second thing about children is absolutely. So what are we doing here is personalized nutrition and personalized intervention. So the sooner we can understand our patients and understand what's happening at a molecular level, the sooner we can make better decisions for them, because we know that all chronic disease takes 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years to develop. And if we can understand what those vulnerabilities are, those pathways that have been impacted by genetics, we can address them younger. We are a practitioner-based company, so ultimately it is for the practitioner to work with the parents to decide if it's appropriate to test the child and how you're going to use the information. Because if you're a practitioner and the parent wants to test their child because they want to decide whether they should, put them into pro football at 5 or whether they should play basketball, that I'll leave that up to you to decide. But if they're trying to make sure, if there's mood disorders in the family and they really want to help their kids making the best possible choices at a young age that are going to inform the diet and lifestyle decisions that they make, it's extremely valuable. So we do not decide for you what age to test at. We work with practitioners and enable you to be able to make those decisions. But we definitely work with testing children.
Okay, that's great. And I think that's all the questions we have. I wanted to give Dr. Sedano this opportunity. Did you want to chime in on anything, Doctor?
Yeah, I'd like to just for a moment, and I know we're running a little over time, but I will tell you, I've looked at a lot of the genetic tests throughout the years, and this is the first one that I believe puts everything together that is clinically useful right from the get-go. And I want to thank Dr. Joffe for putting it together and that wonderful team they have. And I have seen the results of people ordering the test and matching the two together with clinical conditions and the results from this test. So it's definitely worth at least ordering it once and maybe ordering it on yourself as a test, because I order a lot of tests when I start on myself and to kind of test it out if you're not sure. It's certainly worth it. And thank you so much, Dr. Joffe.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me over here and enabling me to share with you, and look forward to working with all of you in the future.
Doctor, if you wouldn't mind proceeding to the next slide, and then we'll conclude here.
Okay.
Just going to give everyone some information on how to learn more about Avexia or to contact us. You can always gain more information at www.avexiadiagnostics.com or call us at 888-852-2723 Monday through Friday with extended hours 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or always email info@avexiadiagnostics.com. Thank you again for joining us for this webinar event. I want to thank Dr. Joffe and Dr. Sedano for this informative presentation. Until next time, from everyone at Avexia Diagnostics and 3x4 Genetics, stay healthy, stay safe, and we wish you all the best on your pathway to wellness. Thank you. Good night,
Thank
everybody.
you. Good night.